want to acknowledge that Laurier's Waterloo campus is located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict.
From the Haldeman Proclamation of October 25, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the river, the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of said river, which then and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserves demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory.
I first met Yvonne Shorter Brown 20 years ago, almost to the day, actually. It was at the end of October in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dalhousie University was hosting a conference celebrating the 400th anniversary of the presence of people of African descent. She's a retired teacher, a university lecturer, and former school trustee. She's currently an adjunct professor in the Social Justice and Community Studies Department of St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Since retirement, she has become an independent historical researcher and author. She enjoys historical autoethnography research, the method she employed to write her memoir, Dead Woman Pickney, a memoir of childhood in Jamaica, which is published by Laurier Press in 2010 and released in a second revised edition with new research and photographs in 2022. The second edition is now available widely through all the usual places in a variety of formats, paperback, PDF, ebook, audiobook. So if you're an instructor, if you're in a book club and you're looking for something to read and to share with others, you can get it in numerous formats. It's distributed through the University of Toronto Press, and you can also get it through local libraries. She's also published several journal articles on African Black people's status in the history of education in Canada. And she's currently working on a political biography of Charles Archibald Reed, born in 1887 and who died in 1944, and he was your grandfather. So, without further ado, please help me to welcome Dr. Yvonne Shorter Brown.
So I want to thank Carol for being such a constant friend and support. I would like to flip the order of things to say that Carol has been my mentor because when I read that first manuscript in Halifax, I was reading it to see if it had any publication potential because it was such a dive into using the patois. Hi, Tennille. It's such a dive into the patois and revealing so much of my own personal self. But as I've mentioned in the book, in writing, I felt I needed to go beyond the recollections of things that happened to me and that have happened to, in fact, all the people in Jamaica who survived the emancipation without any reparations, no money, no land, no none. And I must tell you, I speak patois and I like to use a patois. I think critically in patois because when I grew up, people had an immediate response to any social justice or political issue. It was direct and in the patois. And the patois is accurate, it's strident, and you ask no question about what the person means. And so in writing this story, I wanted to honor the patois because many of us in Jamaica, especially, I'm going to use a term which developed along the way. There are some of us who are so socialized into the British way, they call us Afro-Saxon. So there are some of us Afro-Saxon who won't speak the patois at all. They say it's, you're not educated if you don't speak patois. And some of the most intelligent people I know as a child never went to school, never learned the English in a formal way, and they were the wisest and kindest people I knew. Hence, the title of the book is in patois. And I've been asked, several Jamaicans say, "Me no want hear about no dead woman Pickney." Do you understand what I just said? I don't want to hear about any dead woman Pickney. Others have said, "Why are you airing your dirty laundry in public?" Now, to speak about certain things or to write about them, people have you be responsible that you are airing your dirty laundry in public. My answer to that is that much of the dirty laundry needs to be bleached and scrubbed and hung out in public. We need to release them because we live, many of us live in private worlds with a lot of trauma, which we don't say to anybody. And some of us are hyper-Christian, where we don't feel we need any counseling. All we need to do is to take it to Jesus, and Jesus will fix everything for you. And I remember in my youth, there was a fierce debate about birth control. And the churches were up against it, really up against birth control. And one young minister said, "Oh yes, God gave us the rain, but God didn't tell us not to wear a raincoat." So the moral of that for me is, yes, your faith is important and should be observed, but we're also human beings in community where there are elders and wise people who are able to give you counseling that complements your faith. And that's what I'll say about that. How I came to write this book is that there were certain memories that haunted me. They would not go away. And the one that haunts me most is, who is my mother? Why no one will tell me who my mother is and what has happened to her? And I must tell you in advance, this is going to be a very difficult lecture for me to do. Carol asked me to read a certain section, and I read it myself, and I cried for hours, so I can't read it for you tonight. It's the section where I finally found my mother, and I say, "Greetings, mother." How I wrote it was "Dear Mother," but the editor said "Greetings," in which I was trying to have a conversation with her, to tell her of the long journey I traveled to find her, and that I couldn't rest and go to my grave without honoring her. I had set out and had hoped to find her bones somewhere where I could pay proper respects to her, perhaps making her a headstone or something. But after years of searching, the psychiatrist, Freddie Hickling, is dead now. I caught him just in time. He was head of the asylum hospital, and he helped me to figure out what may have happened to her. And you'll have to read that part. Now, to the business of the Colonial project, as Carol calls it. Jamaica is not the only place that's been affected. Anywhere over the last 500 or 600 years where colonization has taken place, every single one of us is affected. I would like to say to the group of you tonight that each one of you are carrying the genetic memory of colonization where you came from, whether it's from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and most of all, for my purpose along the west coast of Africa and Central Africa. So I'm going to start by reading one vignette, which I'm in a teacherly fashion. I'm going to ask you to listen to see if you see any legacy of colonialism and slavery. And I'm going to quiz you after, before I get right into the paper, okay? Now, this episode has to do with the people of hazard. So this memory, besides the memory of my mother that haunts me, her absence, these people, as a small child, I saw these people in a village, in an area, and it wouldn't go away. So I've written about it. And by the way, I should tell you, I don't do autoethnography. I do autohistory. And it took me a long time to find out why it's not autoethnography. I wasn't talking about culture. I was talking about history. You see the difference? And I have come to be very suspicious of anthropology, ethnography, and the like. So you can ask me about that later and I'll tell you why. Okay, but when I wrote this, the only thing I could find to describe what I was doing was ethnography and autoethnography. Now, in retrospect, it's about history, not only my personal history, but the history of Jamaica. And if you widen the circle, it's the history of the British colonization. And if you widen the circle, it's the history of the colonization of Western Europe, countries in Western Europe. Okay, so here's this vignette. I cannot leave the landscape of Karen Hall and its environs without writing about the people of Hazard. The memory of this place has haunted me all my life. I have returned so many times in my imagination and my nightmares to scenes of abject poverty etched in my mind. Who were these people? I have tried to find the answer to the condition of the people of Hazard. Now I find I write about the people and this place in order to understand the hold it has had on me. My encounter with Hazard begins with what happened when my sister Sonia brought our father's Bible to school, a King James Version, the kind that was leather bound with the finger grooves and the rice paper leaves and the beautiful drawings. The Bible was a very expensive edition. The lettering was ornate, especially the red and gold calligraphy at the beginning of each book. Placed throughout were portraits of Saul, David, Jesus, and other notable characters. Finger grooves helped the reader to locate passages. At the back of the volume, family births and deaths were recorded. As I grew older and felt the need to show off in school, I was to do similar things. On our way home from school that day, Sonia stopped suddenly and exclaimed, "The Bible is missing from my bag." We all ran back breathlessly to search. We had to recover it, for as sure as the sun sets, our father would miss the Bible and give us a murderation. Okay, and that's patois. You can guess what a murderation is. She and Trevor, that's my brother, speculated who might have stolen it. This person must surely live in Hazard. The three of us had to get to this place beyond the school, which lay in the opposite direction from our home, and to get back before the sun sets. My sister had hoped that someone would confess and give it up, or at least provide us with a hint of who had stolen it. For my part, I was the youngest one, the little runt. I began to get the nervous stomach ache that would come when I anticipated my father's wrath and his floggings. As I ran to keep up with Trevor and Sonia, I could feel my heart thumping against my chest, and I heard it pumping in my throat. The wheezing of my asthma started up again. I began to cry like a little puppy dog. As we got into Hazard, the sights of the people both scared and transfixed me. It was the first and last time that I beheld such a scene in Jamaica, and it has stayed and it haunted me until now. I remember clusters of thatch roof huts with bamboo wattle. Wattle is the strips of bamboo that are woven between long poles, and mud daubed sides in various degrees of decay. Small preschool children ran around naked in front of the yards. As they ran about rather lazily, the little boys' penises and distended testicles flopped about. These jet black skinny children had big heads covered with red hair and protruding navels and looked very strange. From a string around their necks hung a pendant cashew nut. A dot of indigo blue was stamped on each forehead. A few mothers sat under a shade tree nursing naked babies, while old women fanned fires under big iron pots set on 3 rocks. They must have been cooking their dinner. One father who sat in the doorway of a hut, smoking a pipe, got out to find out what we wanted. His eyes were bloodshot and his teeth were yellow. My brother told him that we were looking for our father's Bible, which had been stolen from school that day. He mumbled an answer that I could not understand, and he glared at us angrily so that we knew we had insulted him. We knew also that we must leave Hazard or else risk a beating. We never recovered the Bible. Our tyrannical father, devoid of any Christian charity, beat us within an inch of our lives for having lost this precious book. This experience was one among many of my sister's various adventures. Episodes my brother and I usually paid with a hiding. We saw her as our common enemy, an inveterate liar who dragged us into situations that were bound to antagonize the tyrant. My father himself called her the stiff-necked wench. I later had a chance to visit, and by the way, that term is so derogatory. I don't know if I mentioned in the story, I didn't know what it meant until I started reading African American women's fiction and saw the word and realized that that was the name that the enslavers gave to the Black women in the plantation. I later had a chance to visit Hazard again under different circumstances. Eutedra's brother, that's one of my father's paramours, owned a cane piece there. A cane piece is the small farmer's acreage. That is if they have as much as an acreage where they planted sugar cane and supplied to the centralized factory and earned a little money as income. A relatively small lot of land cultivated in sugar cane that is to be sold to the large sugar factory. And I went with her to visit him. Her brother lived at the foot of a mountain from which cascaded a waterfall. As the volumes of water rolled off the mountain top, they sprayed big clouds of mist that came to settle in a big, beautiful blue lagoon. The blue, shimmering lagoon pulled me forward like a magnet. The place was spooky. My head began to spin. I must have been about to fall in because someone grabbed me roughly by the scruff of my neck and asked, "You want to drown, Pickney?" Over 50 years later, when I visited Mrs. Elliott, my infant school principal, I asked her about the people of Hazard. Our conversation went something like this. Mrs. Elliott, who were the people of Hazard? Oh, those people were beyond the reach of the church. They cut themselves off, smoked pangola grass, and beat their drums all night. She elaborated. They kept us awake with their drums. We knew when it was daybreak because the drums were quiet. Very few of their children came to the infant school. That's where I went. When they came, they spoke a language that we could not understand. She told a story of holding a little girl in her arms all day until her older brother came to get her. He had to translate that she was saying she was alone and lonely for her brother and her parents. I asked, "What is pangola grass?" And she responded, Pangola grass was a grass imported from the United States to feed dairy, cattle, and horses because it made the cows give good milk. Pangola likes the clay soil of Hall and parts of Manchester. Earlier on, somewhere I described Mrs. Elliott, the principal, and which takes us on nature walks and make us dig up the clay and model not plasticine. The clay was what plasticine came to be in Canada. I was aware that poor Black people shunned the church and smoked ganja, but I had never heard of pangola grass before. I knew of guinea grass, which was grown in special pastures to feed the plantation cattle in pens attached to the big plantations. The cattle was used to draw the mill to juice the cane, and was also used for meat. And the enslaved people got the tripe and the oxtail, which is a favorite to this day, and the foot, cow foot. There's a dance, look up on the internet, there's a cow foot dance. That's one heritage we have, a sense of humor, a sense for the ridiculous and the sublime at the same time. I knew the guinea grass, which was grown in special pastures to feed the plantation cattle in pens attached to the plantations. By the way, the cattle also gave manure. When Mrs. Elliott explained about the pangola grass, I suddenly recalled that there was a verdant green pasture directly opposite the cluster of huts. Big fat brown cows roamed and grazed the pastures in satiated bliss. Ticks sucked their blood, while blackbirds perched on their broad backs and in turn fed on the fat ticks. I infer that the monitor, this is where the research kicks in, the history kicks in now. I infer that the monetary worth of these people was no longer calculable in the plantation ledgers of old. Alongside the steers, the mules, the plows, and the wheelbarrows. Chattel slavery that describes. Speculating that Karen Hall and Hazard must have been plantations, I refer to the survey of plantations in Jamaica during the 18th and 19th centuries, drawn up by Barry Higman. Its maps and plans suggest evidence of cattle pens and pastures with many sugarcane pieces around, and the waterfall would have offered a source of energy for a water wheel as well as supply of fresh water for the people and the cattle. Small farmers grew ground provisions in yams, potatoes, taro, as well as other vegetables. The African workforce lived in kraals, K-R-A-A-L-S, called Negro huts, which were located on the edge of the plantation. Confirmation that Hazard was indeed a plantation was found in the 1941-42 West Indies yearbook including also the Bermudas and Bahamas, British Guyana, and British Honduras. All of these are British territories. In this book, I found that Alfred and William Champagny owned the Hazard Estate, which was listed each year until 1946 or 47, when it no longer appeared as an entry. Who were these people who were beyond the reach of the big Presbyterian church that dominated the area? I speculate that they were direct descendants of Igbo people from the Guinea coast to work on the sugar plantation. They had become part of the human refuse that was created following the dismantling of the sugar estates that dominated a large tract of land encompassing Caron Hall, Donington, Hazard, and Montreal. Throwaway people left in Negro huts to rot, their children malnourished and infected with yaws and sugar, their minds numbed by Pangola grass, and their souls eased at least by the frantic beat of their ancestral drums. The drums must have preserved their spiritual language, spoken their joys, their sorrows, and their rage. The drumbeat must have spoken to them and for them, calling out to their deities and their kin in faraway Igbo land, their motherland, their home. The people of Hazard must have been struggling against all odds to preserve their African identity and pride in an alien land. Their way of life had resisted the call of church bells, pipe organs, and the triumphal hymns that hailed the greatness of European civilization. While the missionaries of the Presbyterian Church rang bells, played the pipe organ, sang hymns with their African converts, the so-called biblical sons of Ham beat their drums to remind them of Africa and their forced exile. These were the holdouts. They had refused communion with those who had enslaved them. Can you see any connection to the Colonial Project? The Colonial Project, as Carol calls it, has always fascinated me. And since I published this book, the first edition, I ended it, I didn't find the answer, but I ended up with a tremendous amount of grief and sorrow when I considered the number of wasted bodies as the people trekked in couples across the African continent, held in warehouses along the coast, the Guinea coast, the African coast. And I later learned, I did a year postdoc at Tubman Institute with Paul Lovejoy, the historian, just studying slavery. And I learned that there were up to 70 of those warehouses along the West Coast. And has anybody here gone to Ghana or been to the castles? Those walls are about 3 feet wide. So once they put you in there, you can't get out, right? And Dion Brand has written about the door of no return, that once you went through that door, there was no return. I have been to Ghana, and I've been to Madagascar and West Africa because part of my research, I'm fascinated with how much information is stored, is left on the landscape. In any of the colonized places you go, you will see a big church, you will see the courthouse, you will see the jail, you will see the administrative building, and where there's a coastline, you will see forts along the coastline with these big cannons pointing out. Jamaica had 10 forts along. And even little Tobago, when you go to little Tobago, I swear that there are more cannons pointing out from Tobago than the size of the little island. Everywhere you go, there are these forts. It doesn't matter if it's British, Portuguese, or which one of them. They came to take the land, but they're also in competition. Okay? So now, what do I want to do? I would like to, I think the most useful thing I could do tonight is to take up the business of the Colonial project, because it's something, you see, anthropology has dwarfed history in our academy. Culture, 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 culture. And I'm not knocking Canadian multicultural policy, because it gave me permission to go to every public event of every group. It also gave me permission, when I was an active person, to go out into every community of newly arrived immigrants to talk to them. And I was interested in having them validate their teaching credentials, because many of, as you know the story, many professionals come, and because they don't have Canadian experience, nor someone to show them how to negotiate their way, they do alternative things and they never fulfill their calling. And I was determined to go out there and say, come on, any teachers here in your country, come let me show you how you validate your certificate. I got into a lot of trouble, but I didn't care, because from the 80s, there was a trek of Africans from the continent displaced by colonial confusion of redrawing boundaries, stealing their minerals, taking their territory, and they came with nothing. When they came, they weren't telling me about culture. They were telling me about the Civil War, the corruption of the nationalist governments, the loss of their land, the hardships of unemployment. This is what they were telling me about. Sure, they would feed us and dance, and we go and dance and so on. But when I face to face in conversation, I was hearing parallel stories to the stories of the colonized off the continent, whether it's from Trinidad or St. Vincent. My talk is not unique to Jamaica, because it was the same thing throughout the British West Indies. And when we get together, we discover that there's a form of patois in Trinidad, in St. Vincent, in Grenada, everywhere. Because I tell you what, when the slave traders brought the people, they're all mixed up. Igbo, Nigerian, all of them. They speak hundreds of languages. What they came when they came to Jamaica was a transshipment port, Kingston Harbor, Black River, which is now completely destroyed by the Hurricane Melissa, was one of the slave trading harbors. And I don't know if you've heard about the story of the Zong, that ship that was going to Jamaica with forget how many hundred enslaved people. And they threw these people overboard in order to collect insurance money. Black River was the place they were heading for. So Black River in Jamaica, I noted how flat it is, you know, in the hurricane, and it pains me. But the colonial template applies to all of us. Okay, let's see if I will start with the triangular trade, and I'm sure all of you have heard about the triangular trade. And what I want to point out to you is that Canada is also part of it, although it doesn't show there. But look at the number of trade goods that's involved. And people, African people from the various nations are part of that. And the Middle Passage is the one that we know about, that one between West Africa and the United States and the Caribbean. There was continued communication among all of these. And you see, it was not only the slave trade, but there was sugar, molasses, wood, and the whale oil. It was part of that whole thing because a body of literature, fiction came out of this whole experience. The next one I want to show you is how they did it, how they managed to capture so much of the globe. Well, it's not really capture, it's stealing. Wouldn't you agree? Stealing. They call it appropriation. They appropriated the land. Nice language, huh? Okay, so first of all, during all of this, they had people who say they were going on explorations across the continent and producing literature that said that African people were savage, uncivilized, they never produced any culture, they never made anything. In the meanwhile, they're stealing their metallurgy, they're stealing their minerals and everything. But they did it by stealing the indigenous land, and the crown and the chartered companies were the biggies. You think today's multinationals are new? No, they're not. Here are the precursors. There were special hereditary land grants to the crown, to nobles, gentry, merchants, and they were given license to plunder and mine gold, all the silver, all the gold, all iron, everything. In Jamaica, you should see people who are slave traders and stuff still own the land, and the people have, that is the situation throughout all the colonies. Very little proportionally of the land is available to the local people. Then I found it interesting that they must have thought they died and gone to heaven when they discovered North America and Africa, because they call it lumber forests. When I was in school, I learned that in Canada, there were lumberjacks, and they float the lumber down the St. Lawrence River and so on and so on. But the best thing for them was the shipbuilding, because when Columbus started out, he had 3 dinky little ships that could barely sail back home. So, and by the time I went to Portsmouth ship dock this summer, and when I went, because I have a fascination with this ship technology, how it became more complicated and strong. And the real warship was ironclad. Get it? No more wooden ships. It was covered in iron. So when that allowed Britain to rule the waves, because nobody could beat her after that. And she cleaned up everybody off the ocean. Now, I found it interesting that the trees they call lumber forests, and of course it's not only ships, but railways, right? Because on the land, they come, land, but all this stuff, how do you get it out? We need railways. Oh, look at all those, in the Caribbean during the colonial days, on the plantations, they had a militia, and the militia was only made up of white folks because they didn't want to give the black folks ammunition. Then you had the Island Defense Force, JDF, Jamaica Defense Force, and the Royal Regiment, and out in the harbor you had a man of war. So any funny business with the slaves, in came the ship, and they had an armory in Barbados and a slew of marine people, and they just send a telegram or whatever, and how rolling, and the enslaved people better be quiet, quell the rebellion right away. And of course, there was big fishing vessels for ground fishing. So to this day, we have ackee and sawfish, and we have New Brunswick sardines. How many people knew that New Brunswick sardines came from New Brunswick? We ate that. It used to be for 3 pence when I was a kid, and that was dinner, cooked up with scallion and onions and tomatoes. You know, 1 little sardine served for a whole family. That was how poor we were, many of us. And the fishing vessels clean up. So now poor Newfoundland has barely any fish to sell anymore. because of the big trawlers that put them out. Look at the territories covered. And I will, you see, all over. And it's, their enterprise involves 3 continents: the Americas, North and South, Africa, and Asia. Do you see why they love the colonies so much? You see how many of them got hired, got a livelihood? And the colonial civil service was big. It took us 124 years in Jamaica to become full citizens after slavery was abolished in 1838. It really wasn't. When I discovered, the folks used to say in Patois, oh, they never give us no emancipation. Give and take back, give and take back. Now we talk about sleight of hand, eh? Or clever use of language. When the folks said give and take back, they understood that is only words. It really wasn't any freedom, because they were told, and in the front of the book, this is the 2nd edition, I put the Emancipation Proclamation that the governor read to these people. And they weren't free because Monday morning you have to go back and work for your master at whatever rate master will pay you. And you better obey. And by the way, there was a grudge match set up with that psychology. The planters who couldn't run back to England lost everything because they couldn't boss the people around to work as they did with the whip and whatnot. So they couldn't pay their mortgages, they couldn't pay their taxes, and they were fiercely mad. The people who they expected to work for them, as the Emancipation Proclamation said, and they wouldn't work, each side was mad at each other. And it set up a revenge cycle. I learned the big word, revanchism. I like big words, you know. I look them up and I try them out. And as a kid, I used to do this trick of jawbreaker. And if my brother would say, you have a dictionary in your head. So you just take in how much. And the British Navy did not want the trade to be abolished. And I have another thing somewhere else where I listed their arguments against abolishing it, because there wouldn't be anything for them to do, right? Because they were the big linchpin of keeping empire together. And then the colonials, the government said, oh, we will have you go and police the others who haven't yet abolished. You can treat it as contraband trade and stop those ships and take those enslaved people off. And guess what they do with them? They take them to Sierra Leone and Liberia, and they recycle them as indentured. So those people of hazard, my guess is that they were indentured. That's why they couldn't speak in a way that the infant school teacher could understand. Look at how much capital they had invested. And some of those capital industries still last. Bank of England is still going well. Bank of Scotland is still going well. And when my first job, when I dropped out of high school, I applied to Barclays Bank, Dominion, Colonial, and overseas. And I didn't know what I was learning. All the money from the sugar estates, there were several in the parish in which I lived. That bank handled the money, and it would come in big trunks. And little me, they took me out of the dungeon because people with my skin color wasn't light enough to work in the bank, and things were changing. So they gave me a job in the filing room, which was beside the treasury, the vault. Well, of course, as I say in the story, I read every piece of paper, and I knew who had bad and doubtful debt and who borrowed money and all of this kind of stuff. And then I learned the bureaucratic language. So I can write those. I used to write some of those bureaucratic letters when I had to at UBC and write to students. Oh boy, did I ever have a good time. But they were good letters, because I would tell them how to, you know, if you do so many credits, you can apply to have your pay raised to so and so. But it was the rhythm of that bureaucratic language that came back to me. So you see all of that. See, and that the joint stock, just think about the multinationals now and look at this. Do you see that this is the, what do you say now? Antecedents, the precursors, the foundation? Okay. Now look at all the institutions that were connected to that old enterprise. From a feminist point of view, I want to bring your attention to partus sequitur ventrum. There was a law that said that African people were chattels. They were movable property. They were bought, sold, mortgaged out, beaten, killed, branded, all of this. They were not people. However, this applied to both men and women. But in the case of women, the women's wombs were commodified. How many people know that in Jamaica there are many children whose fathers are not on their birth certificate? And here is why. In slavery, because the human beings were treated as cattle, the women have the capacity, as you know, to have babies. So they say, in order to keep their native stock, because when the trade was abolished, slavery went on for another nearly 100 years, I think. I might not have it right. 1807 to another 30 years. So they want to increase their stock because they used to work the people so hard, they died early because they worked them to death and discard them and buy new ones. And when the debate about the abolition was really going on, the slave owners would put in orders because there were agents in every capital taking orders. The slave owners began to order girl children between the ages of 12 and 15 for the express purpose, and this is a language that's used, of breeding. You see? So the children had to belong to the mother in their thinking. So every child born to a black mother, whether the father is white or black, is a slave. However, if the child was born to a white woman, even if he risked his life and mated with a white woman, the child would be free. See? But not necessarily have the father's name because he had to be married. You see? So in Jamaica, the consequence of all of this is that women had a whole heap of babies. I don't know how many of you know that some women who have 10, 15, 17 children. And it was hard on their bodies because they were malnutritioned. And they used to say the women lose a tooth for every child. You could actually see the enamel thinning out. 3 categories of children out of this slavery experience. The men were turned into studs, by the way. So they say free for all, free sex, anybody. And it's the white men and the black men after the black women's bodies. But 3 categories of children. You had legitimate children born to those who were married, and they could inherit property. They could have their father's surname. Then you had illegitimate children who were born to couples who lived together, except for marriage, long-term relationships. And then you had the bastards who were given birth to by single women who were not married or living in a what they call permanent concubinage. When you read some of this language, you cringe. Okay? And so that's why, so those, like in my case, as I've said in my thing, my mother was illegitimate. She had a legitimate sister, and the sister disinherited her. She could do that, the law permitted it, right? And the use of the word bastard was common, and mongrel, half-breed, mulatto, all of these terms were used in that milieu. Now look at all those chartered companies. And there are 2 big ones I don't have in here. Hudson Bay Company, and they just went out of business, but the charter still stands. And the other one that's not there is the East India Company, the one in India that managed everything on Asia. And these companies at many times became the governing body and loco the crown. And these companies traded, interfered with local political concerns, and they earned a lot of money. What is interesting is the number of the kinds of people who went to the colonies. So there were the aristocrats who stayed in England and were puppet masters. Then in England, they had the enclosures of the commons, where the lot of land that was dedicated for local people to come and have fun and so on. The British government enclosed it. Take those people off the land, put them on a ship, send them to Canada, Virginia, the slave colonies. Send kids, Jamaica, anywhere they will go. Then Scotland had something called Highland clearances, where they cleared the crofters and the small farmers who had hereditary land rights. They cleared them off it and shipped them away. And guess what? Stick sheep on the land. So we get Donegal tweed and all of that nice wool stuff from Scotland, while the people who should be on that land were sent to the New World. There are more Scottish names in Jamaica than is in Scotland. Yeah, that's what I discovered in my research. They also emptied the jails, the workhouses, and I'd like to irreverently say, well, maybe I shouldn't, the asylums, the orphanages. In Canada, there's a group of people called the Bernardo orphans, where these young people were taken from this orphanage and sent to Canada to work in the farm with farm families. When I took a genealogy course, and some of them were in tears trying to find out, to track their parents, their roots. So this whole colonial project swept up a lot of people, dispossessed them of their native land, and dumped them together to be either work in the mines, work in the plantations, or some other endeavor to benefit the crown and the aristocrats and the merchants. And there were an estimated 10 to 12 million bodies, African bodies, that were transported to the West Indies and North America. And, you know, the technologies that were used, interesting. The one that killed me is the invention of an array of instruments of bondage, from iron shackles and the whole bit. And what, in my experience, I had an assignment in Indonesia, and I did not know about the Dutch colonization. Taking anthropology, I took an anthropology of Indonesia, and I learned about the gamelan orchestra and the Dutch civilizing mission. When I went to my students in Indonesia, and they took me around, I went to 26 Teachers College because they got the World Bank to fund the transformation of normal schools into universities. And when they took me around and showed me the Dutch plantations in tea, coffee, sugarcane, I could smell the sugarcane just like I smelled it as a child in Jamaica. And the worst thing, they took me to the museum in Jakarta, and I was seeing the same instruments of torture as I saw used in the West Indies and the US. I was shocked to my boots. You see, because school did not teach this kind of history. And it comes as a surprise. And when you hear it at first, you say, oh, that couldn't be. That never happened. And you see it happens, you see that phenomenon over and over again, where when these revelations are made as facts, people say that didn't happen. And I used to say that people wouldn't do that until I start reading. I said, God, they did. And then having to deal with my father, my God, a descendant of that mentality. and my father's family. I write about his sisters because that's the ones I grew. And they were not all bad, as I try to portray, like my Aunt Joyce, the one who saved my life as an infant because I had trauma, asthma, childhood trauma, when you get asthma and so on. She saved my life. But I was going to be her little servant. He's not paying the school fees for me to go to secondary school. She says, who's going to do the housework? And I would hide under the pillow with a flashlight to read and do my homework. And she said, you always have your nose in a bloody book. I still have my nose in a bloody book to this day, you know, because I had the brains. As if, folks would say in Patois, she have the brain box, meaning you have, you know, lots of brain. And there are all these ideologies, not only racism, that fueled it, okay? There's all kinds, the doctrine of discovery, and I'm sure you remember the momentous occasion a couple of years ago when the Pope, the First Nations people have the Pope come here. By the way, I'm indebted to the First Nations colleagues I had at UBC, because it's through their struggle that I thought, oh wait, this is familiar. I've been talking about the same things when I left Jamaica, the language, the slave, a bondage, the whole bit. This is my pet peeve, the invention of academic disciplines such as ethnology, anthropology, ethnography, and the genre of travel writing and fiction. Heart of Darkness, and all them nigger of the Narcissus, wholly for them, and a whole lot of travel novels. Those who have read the book will know I ended the first edition by saying, I say a silent requiem for all those who lost their lives. And this monument was done in 2006, the year before the celebration of the 200 years since the trade was abolished. And it's mounted near Grenada. So thank you for coming out, and thank you for your attention, and I hope it was worth your while.